روح كخمائرها العذقى نقطف أزهار الفن ننسجها أجمل لحن نقطف أزهار الفن ننسجها أجمل لحن لعيون القدس نغني 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 لعيون القدس نغني
Radio 786, 100.4 FM stereo, the station that gets you thinking, listening and talking.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. The time is now 9:29 and it's time for our panel discussion this evening. And tonight's live telephone link-ups for the panel discussion, the topic Israel, past, present and future, is sponsored by Dr. Correlay. Night surgery open from 8 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. from Monday to Sunday, 42 Biscouten Road in Gleamore. Athlone, telephone 696-7123. Ascot Motors, your tyre, mag and battery discounters, New Ottery Road in Ottery. Medicam Pharmacy, your Link Pharmacy in Belgravia Road, Athlone. We offer Hajj packs at reasonable prices. Phone 6967-557. And in Sheikh's Exotics, Blomfley Road in Lansdowne, telephone 692-1354. So those are the people who made this link up possible for us this evening. And to host this panel discussion is our brother Aziz Kader. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to greet the listeners. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. I welcome the listeners to our panel discussion this evening on Israel, past, present and future. And I would like to say to the listeners that the Zionist state of Israel exists for almost 50 years. A state which has seen since its inception countless wars, severe violence and brutality, mass dislocation of people, and a state whose existence has caused a lot of destabilization in an entire region and whose internal politics invariably has international repercussions. The state of Israel contains land and religious sites, which is dear to three of the major religions of the world, and it has a city called Jerusalem, coveted by all the major powers of the world throughout world history. The state of Israel is somewhat of an enigma. The Zionists say that this is a Jewish homeland, land of their forefathers, and their rightful place. Yet the bulk of the Jewry live outside of Israel, having no intention of settling there. And the Zionists speak for Jews and Judaism, they say. Yet the Zionist state of Israel is a secular state. And the Zionist state of Israel claims it is the only democracy in the Middle East. Yet we have 4 million Palestinians in exile. And when democracies guarantee freedom of movement, we have large territories that are regularly sealed off. These are just some of the examples. In our studio tonight, we have Imam Ahmad Qasim, who is the chairperson of the Islamic Unity Convention, past political activist and political prisoner, and has spent 22 years of his life either being imprisoned or banned by the apartheid state. Also in the studio, we have Mr. Keith Gottschall of the Department of Political Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Also an anti-apartheid activist, was a member of the UDF, the United Democratic Front, the African National Congress, and is also a member of the Congress of South African Writers. He has published books on poetry and entitled Emergency Poems, and another booklet on poetry called Joy of Flying. He is a political scientist and has some insights on Israel. On the line from the United States, we have Mark Bruzonsky, who is part of the Committee of Middle East and Middle East Realities. He was in 1984 the Washington representative of the World Jewish Congress, when that organization was headed by Nahum Goldberg and Philip Klutznick and Edgar Bronfman. And he was personal assistant to Philip Klutznick, the former president of Die Brith International, as well as the World Jewish Congress, and Secretary of Commerce during the Carter administration for many years. Bruzonsky has been a consultant on the Middle East for a number of organizations, including Congressional Quarterly, the National Geographic Society, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at the Smithsonian, where he published Security in the Middle East, Regional Change, and Great Power Strategies. Bruzonsky's articles and interviews have appeared in numerous publications in the United States, Europe, and Israel, and the Arab world, and his regular column, from Washington, prominently appears in a number of leading newspapers in the Middle East. Also on the line, I have Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who received a doctorate degree at Princeton University in the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and has published 2 books called Image or Reality and The Rise and Fall of Palestine. He has lived and worked in the West Bank every summer for a number of years, and also works for Middle Eastern realities. And on the line from the United Kingdom, we have Imam Al-Asi, a regular panelist to Radio 786 panel programs, and he is fairly well known to the listeners in South Africa. I greet you all and I welcome you all. Assalamu alaikum, good evening and good afternoon.
Thank you, good evening. Wa alaikum salam.
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is Mark in Washington.
Dr. Norman, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you very much. The first question I'd like to ask, possibly of you, Mark, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right. Is the State of Israel founded on Judaism or Zionism, and is there a difference?
Well, actually, after just a short comment, I think Norman's more qualified to answer this one. It's more a theological and historical question, but, you know, you can't think of modern-day Israel without remembering the Holocaust. You've got to remember the state of the Jewish world just 50 years ago. A world that was powerless, a world that had just suffered the traumas of the Holocaust, a world that the refugees from Europe had nowhere to go, and they were being put in detention camps by the British and turned away from the shores of North America. So whatever criticism one has today of Israeli policies and of Zionism, you still have to understand the context in which Israel was created and the context in which the Jewish world rallied around the creation of that state. That said, even we who are Jewish are confused by the combination of a secular state that claims to be a democracy and is for Jews but isn't for the residents who live for the Palestinian residents. We're confused by a state that has dual loyalty and dual citizenship. We're confused by a Zionist ideology which is not agreed on even by many of us Jews in terms of its definition and meaning. But I really do think Norman has studied this and written extensively and brilliantly on this subject, and I think he's better qualified to answer your question.
Norman, I'll get back to you now. I just have omitted to actually introduce some of the other guests. Well, they're not present, but we did invite a member or the head of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and we have received a response, and I shall read the response for the listeners. The response says that I have been instructed by the chairman of the board to acknowledge receipt of your letters dated 11 and 13 February 1997 in view of our pending hearing at the Independent Broadcasting Authority arising out of recent programs by your station. We are of the opinion that it would be inappropriate at this time for the Board of Deputies to participate in the above-mentioned program. We have also invited someone from the Western Province Zionist Council, and they too have answered, and this is the reply that we got. Dear Mesdames Taip and Masoud, thank you for your letter of 11th February 1997. It is difficult to take your invitation seriously, as your station has hitherto failed to display any objectivity in dealing with the subjects of Israel or the peace process. On the contrary, and in particular, the station has frequently broadcast venomous attacks on Israel, and at times the attacks have included hurtful anti-Semitic statements from which your station has failed to dissociate itself. Furthermore, some of your commentators and panelists have shown their unmitigated hatred for Israel. Indeed, according to a report in Die Burger, for the benefit of the visitors overseas, is a morning Afrikaans daily. One of them, to whom your station often turns for guidance, made a speech at a demonstration in the city last Friday calling for nothing less than the destruction of Israel. When your station has manifested a sincere desire to achieve objectivity and balance and to avoid causing offense to our community, such an invitation will be favorably considered. We have also invited the ambassador to Israel, and we have not been able to get him online. He has indicated last week sometime that he would be interested, and so far there's been no response. Norman, can
Hi,
you come?
how are you?
Yes, thank you. Just to recap, we were talking about the state of Israel, whether it was founded on Judaism or Zionism, and is there a difference? We've got some comment from Mark. Could you add to that, please?
Yes, I guess I agree basically with the last comments of Mark. Not that I disagree with the earlier comments, but trying to deal directly with the issue that you raised. Obviously, there are those individuals who consider themselves believing Jews who see some connection between their beliefs and Zionism, and inversely, there are those who consider themselves Zionists, even non-Jews, who see in Zionism some connection between the ideals of Zionism and Judaism. And those are basically, I suppose, you would call philosophical questions, and I think for the purposes of the discussion at hand, not particularly useful. The more important question, I think, would be the one that Mark suggested, namely, is the Zionist ideal reconcilable with democratic principles? That would be an issue, I think, that would concern non-Jews as well as Jews, and that would be the one I think we'd want to address more directly. And to that, my answer would be fairly straightforward, namely that Zionism is a form of nationalism. In particular, it's a kind of ethnic nationalism which sees ethnicity and not citizenship as the proper foundations of a state. And therefore, from that point of view, from a theoretical point of view, it seems to me that there's obviously a conflict between the idea of an ethnic state, that is an exclusivist state, and a democratic state, which is, at least in theory, inclusive.
Keith, I notice you shaking your head here. Would you want to add to that?
No.
Not yet. Imam?
Yeah, I'd like to come in here on the point of the distinction between Judaism, Zionism, and the State of Israel. A work by Lilienthal called The Zionist Connection 2, he makes the following observation. However much the essence of Judaism may have remained as distinct as ever from Zionism, the nationalist shadow has so overtaken the religious substance that virtually all Jews have in practice become Israelists, if not Zionists. Many who mistrust the Zionist connotation can still have their cake and eat it through Israelism. Now obviously, Theodor Herzl himself had indicated that Zionism should remain secular. And if that is the case, then obviously it has got absolutely nothing to do with Judaism, because you cannot have a dual sovereignty, one to secularism and one religious base to Yahweh or God, etc. That would indicate that there is a position. The first speaker, I think it was Mark Bruzonsky, stated that even Jews are confused about the issue. I think the Palestinians and people in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt are not confused about it, because all knowledge eventually is experientially based, and once you become the victim of those practices, then that is the issue to be tackled, and not the philosophical and theological dimensions.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, either Mark or Norman?
Well, Yes, I would like to add something to that. Of course, from the victim's perspective, from the perspective of Palestinians who have been disenfranchised, who live in refugee camps, and who now, bringing us up to current times, in my judgment, are being the greatest irony of the current decade is that at the same time that apartheid in South Africa has been brought to an end, at least formally, a form of Middle East apartheid is being perpetrated on the Palestinian people in the guise of a peace process that the Americans and American Jews and various organizational representatives are all cheering. And since I did work for a world Jewish organization at one point and have had experiences on both sides of the fence, so to speak, I'd like to just briefly comment on the letters you received. There's nothing unusual here. These groups in this country, in Europe, in South Africa, their purpose is to intimidate all people who don't share their views, especially those who happen to be of Jewish origins, not to participate in honest, open, independent discussions of this type, to attempt to delegitimize those, no matter what their credentials, who don't agree with them or who don't believe that the organizations they represent actually speak in the name of the majority of Jews in the world. And so I'm not at all surprised that although when you first contacted me, you mentioned there were going to be various representatives of the South African Jewish community involved in the program, I'm not at all surprised that that's not the case.
Thank you. Keith, I'd like to draw you in here. You heard that. Were you at all, as a South African Jew, are you at all intimidated by people who try to say that, you don't speak for Judaism, or if you participate in programs like these?
Well, some people would regard me as Jewish. I consider myself an atheist and take the definition of Judaism as a religious one. It certainly was very unpleasant for those who were criticizing Zionism of Israel in the pre-1990 South Africa, where all the daily media backed one side but not the other, and it was a routine Zionist tactic to smear as anti-Semitic anyone who either criticized the Israeli government or Zionism. When you were considered Jewish yourself, it was a bit more difficult to convincingly say you were anti-Semitic. So the standard smear then was, well, you must be mentally insane, you are filled with self-hatred. This struck me as getting the Brezhnev floating trophy for psychiatry, where it was routine at that time that if you opposed the Soviet government, you were certified insane. And I had my fair share of that.
Imam Al-Asri? Imam Al-Asri, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just another question quickly, and I want you to kick this one off before we go around to the other panelists. Would you consider that criticism of Zionism to be also criticism of Judaism, speaking from an Islamic context perhaps, or is it the criticism of the political philosophy?
Well, the issue of Zionism is one area that in the public mind hasn't been very well developed. And I think knowing Radio 786 and knowing to some degree the activities in South Africa, I think because there has been some type of effort in trying to crystallize in your own mind, in the public mind over there, what Zionism is all about. That's probably the major reason why right now you're under all of this tremendous litigation and pressure that you find yourself in. It's almost one of the most impossible things to do, to educate the public in the developed. And I know Mark and I know Norman, although Norman may not know me that well. But I've heard both of them speak. I have to say in all honesty that I've realized that
there are some individuals who come from the Jewish background and context who can be bona fide opponents of Zionism. So that should dispel, at least in the Muslim public mind, the notion that we have to or broadside everyone and say just because they're Jews, they are not capable of opposing Zionism, at least in the theoretical sense. But the area is, unfortunately, these are faint voices in the larger world of reality that all of us are exposed to, especially when reality turns into a brutal military machine that is raining terror from the skies on innocent individuals in bouts of war almost every decade for the past 5 decades. A Zionism that has managed to lodge its influence deep down inside the primary decision-making capitals of the world, especially in Washington, D.C. right now. Clinton is probably the most supportive president of Zionism that the United States has ever had. We don't know if someone can compete with him in a coming administration or not. But I don't want to go far out on this. I want to return to the original area, and that is the ambiguity in which Zionism manages to camouflage itself. It is convenient at times to present Zionism with a Jewish argument and thereby mobilize Jewish public opinion in support of the State of Israel. Sometimes Zionism finds itself into pulpits, many pulpits in churches in the Western world, and somehow, in order to be a very pious and evangelical Christian, you have to support the return of the Jewish people to Israel, and this Israel is the one that is defined by Zionism. And in the process, the fact is overlooked that Zionism is a creature of European history, a form of nationalism, as much as guilty as all other types of nationalism in the Middle East. In this regard, our Jewish friends have shown a failure at trying to understand how Muslims throughout the Middle East are trying to get rid of the scourge of nationalism in their own homes, in their own homelands, as well as getting rid of it in Palestine. This is one area that hasn't been developed. It would serve the purposes of all peoples in the Middle East as well as in the world to try to come out and purge the frictional notion of nationalism that is exclusive. Zionism works just like it's supposed to work. Nationalism is supposed to exclude others by definition, and such is the case with Arab nationalism, etc. And this has become, Judaism has become incarcerated because of the faint voices of those who oppose Zionism after they identify what it is and are familiar with what it has done. There hasn't been enough movement that has been generated in the Middle East, in the context of the Muslims and in the context of the Jews, to see that Zionism or that nationalism, whatever configuration it has brought about all of these tensions that have rendered a Palestinian against an Israeli, an Arab against a Hebrew, and even when Islam and Judaism become subservient to their own local nationalisms, have polarized Judaism and Islam. If we can just take a step out of this and see the damage that was done, and what I mean by this, it is serious damage because we find that the supporters of Zionism have become also supporters of the Arab nation-state system in the Middle East. Remember, just 20 years ago, the Arab nation-states were the mortal enemies of the Israeli nation-state. But all of a sudden, in
let's
the
just keep
process,
we'll skip it there for the time being. I mean, I want to actually get back to either Mark or Norman. Do you, besides the fact that you're looking at the problem of Zionism in relation to democracy and so forth, do you actually accept the state of Israel as it stands there, Norman?
Look, my own view on the topic is not easily summarized in a few words. I don't like, to address formulations like do you accept the state of Israel as it is, because those formulations tend to pigeonhole you in one category or another. So just allow me a couple of minutes.